Rechlin Air Base, Germany, March 19th, 1943. Early morning fog still clings to the runway as Hauptmann Werner Baumbach walks toward an aircraft that should not exist on German soil. The olive drab paint and white star markings have been partially covered with Luftwaffe insignia, but there's no disguising what it is. A Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, serial number 412455, captured intact 4 months earlier after an emergency landing in occupied Netherlands. Baumbach is not here to admire it. He's here to fly it, to test it, to understand it. As chief test pilot for bomber evaluation at Rechlin, Germany's most secretive aircraft testing facility, he's flown dozens of aircraft types, British Lancasters, Soviet Petliakovs, even a captured American B-24. But the B-17 is different. For the past year, these bombers have been appearing over Germany in growing numbers, flying in tight formations at altitudes where German fighters struggle to reach them, absorbing damage that would destroy any German bomber and continuing to their targets. Luftwaffe fighter pilots call them flying porcupines. They report the same thing, mission after mission. Approach a B-17 formation, and you're met with a wall of fire, 1350 caliber machine guns per aircraft. Multiply that by 20 or 30 bombers flying in mutual support, and the mathematics become terrifying. Over 250 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously, creating an interlocking web of tracers that no fighter can safely penetrate. But Baumbach has orders: fly the bomber, understand its capabilities, determine its weaknesses, and, most importantly, figure out how to destroy it before it destroys Germany. What he will discover over the next 3 hours will fundamentally change his understanding of what Germany is facing. The B-17 isn't just a bomber, it's a statement of industrial philosophy, a flying demonstration of how America fights wars. And the 1350 caliber machine guns that make it a fortress in the sky represent something far more dangerous than mere firepower. They represent a nation that can afford to put that much defensive capability on every single bomber it builds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Werner Baumbach was born in 1916 in Berlin. Unlike many Luftwaffe pilots who came from military families, Baumbach's father was a civil engineer. He grew up around blueprints and construction sites, learning to think in terms of structures, loads, and mathematics. When he was 14, his father took him to Tempelhof Airport to watch the passenger planes land. That day changed his life. By 17, he joined a glider club. By 19, he was training with the Luftwaffe as it secretly rebuilt Germany's air force in violation of the Versailles Treaty. He had a gift for understanding aircraft not just as machines to be flown, but as engineering systems to be analyzed. While other pilots focused on stick and rudder skills, Baumbach wanted to know why an aircraft behaved the way it did, what design choices created its characteristics, what compromises the engineers had made. By 1939, when the war began, he was flying Heinkel He-111 bombers in combat. He participated in the invasion of Poland, the campaign in Norway, the Battle of Britain. He flew night missions over England, navigating by dead reckoning through darkness and anti-aircraft fire to hit targets he could barely see. He knew what it meant to be a bomber crew over enemy territory. By 1942, his combination of combat experience and technical knowledge made him invaluable for testing and evaluation. The Luftwaffe needed pilots who could assess captured enemy aircraft not just for performance, but for strategic implications. Baumbach was transferred to Rechlin, where he would spend the rest of the war flying everything the Allies could build. He'd already flown several American aircraft before the B-17 arrived. A P-40 Warhawk fighter captured in North Africa had impressed him with its rugged construction. A B-24 Liberator captured after a forced landing in Norway had demonstrated American mass production capabilities. But the B-17 was the aircraft everyone wanted to understand, because it was the aircraft killing Germany. The bomber Baumbach would fly had an interesting history. Nicknamed Wolfhound by its American crew, it had been piloted by Lieutenant Paul Flickinger on a mission to bomb French rail yards on December 12, 1942. After taking multiple hits from German fighters, with 2 engines failing and fuel leaking, Flickinger had made the desperate choice to land at what he thought was a British airfield. It was actually Leeuwarden, a German-occupied Dutch base. The crew became prisoners. The bomber became a prize. Within 48 hours, the aircraft was being transported to Rechlin. The Luftwaffe moved fast because Allied fighters patrolled constantly, strafing anything valuable on the ground. By December 15th, the B-17 was at Rechlin, where it underwent immediate technical examination. Engineers measured every component, documented every system, analyzed every design choice. Field Marshal Erhard Milch himself had come to inspect it, spending 3 days examining the aircraft and writing a report that concluded Germany was facing an industrial power it could not match. But that was the engineer's perspective, the strategic analysis. Now, 3 months later, it was time for the pilot's perspective. What was this aircraft like to actually fly? How did it handle? What were its strengths and weaknesses in the air? And most critically, what was it like to sit inside that defensive armament system and understand what German fighter pilots faced every time they attacked a B-17 formation? Baumbach completed his walk-around inspection as dawn broke over Rechlin. The aircraft was enormous, dwarfing the German bombers parked nearby. The wingspan measured 103 feet. The fuselage was thick and blunt, designed around internal bomb bay capacity rather than aerodynamic efficiency. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, hung from the wings in massive nacelles. But it was the gun positions that drew Baumbach's attention. They were everywhere. 2 in the nose, flexible mounted to give the bombardier and navigator offensive fields of fire. 2 in the top turret, sitting in a powered Sperry ball mount that could rotate a complete circle. 2 in the ball turret, underneath the fuselage, perhaps the most exposed position on any aircraft in the war. 2 at the waist positions, 1 on each side of the fuselage. 2 in the tail, covering the rear approaches. 1 in the radio compartment, firing through an overhead hatch, 1350 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. Baumbach had seen the technical specifications, but seeing the actual installation was different. This wasn't defensive armament as an afterthought. This was defensive armament as primary design criterion. The entire aircraft had been built around the concept of mutual protection, of bombers flying together and creating overlapping fields of fire that no fighter could safely penetrate. He climbed through the forward hatch and made his way to the cockpit. The interior was surprisingly spacious. German bombers were cramped, every cubic meter of space allocated to fuel, bombs, or equipment. The B-17 felt almost roomy. The crew positions were separated by walkways and crawl spaces. A man could move from the cockpit to the tailgun position if needed, not easily, but it was possible. Baumbach settled into the pilot's seat. The cockpit was well laid out, instruments clearly arranged, controls within easy reach. Everything was labeled in English. But the layout was logical enough that he'd studied the translated manuals and felt confident in the systems. The Germans had been thorough in their documentation, creating detailed handbooks for flying the captured bomber. He went through the pre-flight checklist with the German co-pilot assigned to fly with him, Lieutenant Hans Faber. Faber was younger, less experienced, but a competent pilot who'd been training on the B-17 for 2 weeks. Together, they checked fuel levels, hydraulic pressure, electrical systems, engine controls. Everything was functional. The aircraft had been maintained carefully by German mechanics, using captured spare parts and improvised solutions where necessary. Baumbach started the engines one by one. The radials coughed to life with distinctive rumbling roars, completely different from the inline engines on German bombers. The sound was rough, almost agricultural, but the engines ran smoothly. American radial engines were known for reliability. Air-cooled, they had no vulnerable cooling systems to be damaged by enemy fire. You could shoot cylinders off these engines and they'd keep running. With all 4 engines running, Baumbach received clearance from the tower. He released the brakes and began taxiing toward the runway. The B-17's tailwheel steering took some getting used to, but the aircraft tracked reasonably straight. Visibility over the nose was limited, requiring S-turns during taxi to see ahead, but this was common with tailwheel aircraft. Lined up on the runway, Baumbach advanced the throttles. The acceleration was gradual, but steady. The aircraft was heavy, grossing over 50,000 pounds, with partial fuel and no bombs. The tail came up as airspeed increased. At about 90 miles per hour, Baumbach applied gentle back pressure and the bomber lifted off smoothly. Gear up. Flaps up. Climbing power set. The B-17 climbed at about 700 feet per minute. Not spectacular, but steady and predictable. Baumbach turned onto the prescribed test flight course, heading away from the airfield and toward an area where they could conduct maneuvers without concerning German air defense. As they climbed through 5,000 feet, Baumbach began evaluating handling characteristics. The B-17 was stable, almost excessively so. It wanted to fly straight and level. Control inputs produced smooth, predictable responses with no unexpected behavior. This was an aircraft designed to hold formation through flak and fighter attacks, to absorb damage and keep flying, to be operated by pilots of varying skill levels. German bombers, like the Heinkel He-111, were more responsive, more agile in pilots' hands, but they were also less forgiving. An inexperienced pilot could get into trouble quickly. The B-17 felt like it would protect its crew from pilot error as much as from enemy fire. Faber was examining the instruments and systems. Everything worked as designed. The hydraulic system maintained pressure. The electrical system provided stable power. The vacuum system for the flight instruments operated properly. Nothing was temperamental or quirky. Everything was simply functional. But it was when they reached 15,000 feet that Baumbach decided to examine what made this bomber truly unique: the defensive armament. He needed to understand what German fighter pilots faced, and the only way to do that was to sit in the gun positions and experience the fields of fire firsthand. He trimmed the aircraft for level flight, engaged the autopilot, and told Faber to maintain altitude and heading. Then he unbuckled and moved back through the fuselage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The first position Baumbach examined was the nose guns. Crawling forward past the cockpit, he entered the bombardier's compartment. Two 50 caliber machine guns were mounted on flexible mounts, one on each cheek of the aircraft nose. The plexiglass nose section provided panoramic visibility forward and below, but it also meant the bombardier and navigator were completely exposed to frontal attacks, hence the guns. Baumbach gripped one of the guns and aimed it forward. The mounting allowed wide traverse, covering almost the entire forward hemisphere. But what struck him was the weight of the weapon. The Browning M2 50 caliber was a substantial piece of machinery, originally designed as an anti-vehicle and anti-aircraft weapon. Each gun weighed 84 pounds, unloaded. The ammunition belts added more weight, and this aircraft carried 13 of them. He examined the ammunition boxes. Each gun had approximately 400 rounds available, linked in belts. The 50 caliber round itself was massive compared to the rifle caliber machine guns on German aircraft. Each projectile weighed about 1.5 ounces. When fired at 2,900 feet per second, it carried enormous kinetic energy. A single hit could tear through an engine block. Multiple hits would shred a fighter's thin aluminum skin. The rate of fire for the Browning M2 was approximately 800 rounds per minute per gun. Baumbach did the mental calculation. 13 guns firing simultaneously would launch about 10,400 rounds per minute. That was 173 rounds per second, even a 2-second burst, typical for a fighter making a high-speed pass through a bomber formation, would put over 300 heavy slugs into the air. More importantly, these weren't isolated guns. They were part of a coordinated system. Baumbach had read the intelligence reports from debriefed Luftwaffe fighter pilots. They described how B-17 formations created interlocking fields of fire. If you attacked one bomber from ahead, you'd face fire from that bomber's nose guns, but also from the top turrets of bombers on either side, and possibly from the ball turret of a bomber above. The formations were designed so that no approach angle was safe. He moved to the top turret next, climbing up behind the cockpit. He squeezed into the powered turret seat. This position was operated by the flight engineer, who sat here during combat and in the cockpit during normal flight. The turret could rotate a complete 360 degrees, and the guns could elevate to nearly vertical and depress to horizontal. Baumbach experimented with the controls. Electric motors powered the traverse and elevation, responding smoothly to his inputs. The computing gun sight helped the gunner lead moving targets, compensating for aircraft speed and target motion. This level of sophistication was remarkable. German bombers had hand-aimed guns on simple ring and bead sights. The gunner estimated lead distance, adjusted for his own aircraft's motion, and hoped. This system did much of that calculation automatically. From the top turret position, Baumbach had excellent visibility in all directions. He could see threats approaching from any angle above the horizontal plane. And with the powered traverse, he could track fast-moving fighters and keep firing as they passed. The two 50 calibers in this turret could sustain fire for extended periods, laying down a continuous stream of tracers that would force attacking fighters to break off or risk flying through the fire. The ball turret was next, and Baumbach had been dreading this. Located underneath the fuselage, the ball turret was a spherical installation that rotated on a ring mount. The gunner sat inside this ball in a fetal position, knees drawn up, surrounded by plexiglass and thin armor plating. It was claustrophobic, isolated, and utterly exposed. If the aircraft crash-landed with the ball turret extended, the gunner would be crushed. If the hydraulics failed, the gunner might be trapped inside, unable to exit. Yet, from a tactical standpoint, it was brilliant. The ball turret covered the entire lower hemisphere, the blind spot that most bombers couldn't defend. German fighters had learned to attack from below, diving under bomber formations where defensive fire was limited. The ball turret eliminated that advantage. Any fighter attacking from below would face two 50 calibers aimed directly at it, operated by a gunner with an unobstructed view and a computing gun sight. Baumbach couldn't actually enter the ball turret in flight without a crew member's assistance. The entry procedure was complex, but he examined it from inside the fuselage. The engineering was sophisticated. The turret could be retracted partially into the fuselage for landing, protecting it from ground strikes. The azimuth and elevation controls allowed the gunner to track targets through complete rotation. Even the oxygen and intercom connections were designed to function through full rotation without tangling. The waist gun positions were simpler but no less effective. On each side of the fuselage, large openings allowed gunners to operate single 50 calibers on flexible mounts. These positions had overlapping fields of fire, meaning both gunners could concentrate on a single target if necessary, doubling the fire directed at an attacking fighter. Baumbach stood at one of the waist positions and looked out. The slipstream roared past the opening. The temperature at 15,000 feet was well below freezing. Waist gunners operated in brutal conditions, exposed to wind and cold for hours during missions. Yet, they had to maintain alertness and accuracy because their sectors, the beam approaches from either side, were common attack angles for fighters. Finally, Baumbach made his way to the tailgun position, crawling through the narrow tail section. The tail gunner sat in the most isolated position on the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew, alone in the extreme rear fuselage. Two 50 calibers were mounted here, covering the rear approaches. This position was critical because German fighter tactics increasingly emphasized rear attacks. Come in from behind and below, slightly offset, accelerate through the formation, fire at close range, and break away before the bombers could respond. The tail gunner was the last line of defense against this tactic. Sitting in the tail position, Baumbach had an unobstructed view aft. He could see for miles behind the aircraft. Any fighter approaching from the rear would be visible long before it came into range, giving the gunner time to aim and prepare. and with two 50 calibers, the tail gunner could put enough fire into the air to discourage all but the most determined attackers. After examining all the gun positions, Baumbach made his way back to the cockpit. He'd spent over an hour moving through the fuselage, and he now understood something that the specifications alone couldn't convey. This wasn't just a bomber with guns attached. This was an integrated weapons system designed around the concept of mutual defense. Every gun position covered specific sectors. Every position had overlapping fire with adjacent positions. The fields of fire had been calculated to eliminate blind spots. A fighter attacking from any angle would face fire from multiple guns, operated by multiple gunners, all directing heavy 50 caliber rounds at a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour. And, critically, the aircraft had been designed to keep fighting even after taking damage. The systems were redundant. Multiple fuel tanks meant one or two could be punctured without losing all fuel. Multiple engines meant one or two could fail without crippling the aircraft. The robust structure meant battle damage that would destroy a German bomber would merely create holes in the B-17's airframe. Baumbach settled back into the pilot's seat and took control from Faber. They'd been aloft for over 2 hours. It was time to evaluate combat maneuvers to understand how this aircraft behaved under stress. He began with steep turns, banking the bomber hard to each side. The B-17 responded predictably, holding altitude in the turns without excessive altitude loss. It wasn't agile. No four-engine bomber was, but it was stable and controllable. A formation of these bombers could maneuver together without risk of collisions, maintaining tight defensive groupings. Next, Baumbach tested dive performance. He nosed over into a shallow dive, accelerating to cruise speed and beyond, and the airframe remained solid. No vibrations, no flutter, no concerning sounds. The B-17 could dive away from fighter attacks if necessary, using its weight to build speed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He tested climb performance at various power settings. At full power, all four engines roaring, the bomber climbed steadily even at altitude. The supercharged engines maintained power well into the thin air above 20,000 feet. German fighters, using naturally aspirated engines, struggled at these altitudes, losing power as air density decreased. The B-17 was designed to operate where German fighters couldn't effectively reach. Baumbach experimented with single-engine flight, reducing power on one engine to idle. The asymmetric thrust created yaw, but the bomber remained controllable. With proper trim, it could maintain altitude on 3 engines. Intelligence reports indicated that B-17s had returned to England on 2 engines, or even 1 after sustaining catastrophic damage. After 3 hours of flight testing, Baumbach turned back toward Rechlin. He'd learned what he needed to know, and the knowledge was troubling. The B-17 Flying Fortress was exactly what its name implied. Not invincible, but incredibly difficult to destroy. And the 1350 caliber machine guns that made it a fortress represented something more significant than firepower. They represented American industrial capacity and design philosophy. Germany built bombers optimized for offense, bomb load, range, speed. Defensive armament was secondary. The Heinkel He-111 had perhaps 3 machine guns. The Junkers Ju-88 had up to 6, but they were rifle-caliber 7.92 millimeter weapons. Light, limited range, barely adequate to deter fighters. The Americans had built bombers optimized for survival. The B-17 carried a bomb load smaller than German bombers of similar size. It wasn't particularly fast, but it could fight its way to the target and fight its way back. And in a long war of attrition, survival mattered more than peak performance. Baumbach landed the B-17 smoothly at Rechlin. The robust landing gear absorbed the touchdown without complaint. He taxied back to the hangar where German engineers and officers waited for his assessment. As he shut down the engines and climbed out, several officers approached with questions. "How does it handle?" "Stable and predictable," Baumbach replied. "Easy to fly in formation. Good altitude performance. Excellent visibility from the cockpit." "The defensive armament?" Baumbach paused. This was the critical question. Devastating. See, the coverage is complete. The firepower is overwhelming, and the systems are sophisticated. Powered turrets, computing gun sights, interlocking fields of fire. A fighter attacking a B-17 formation will face fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The casualties will be severe. An older officer frowned. Surely our pilots can overcome this. They have superior training in aircraft. Superior training doesn't matter if you're hit by a .50 caliber round, Baumbach said. Our fighters have thin aluminum skin. A single hit can sever a control cable, puncture a fuel tank, or kill the pilot. The B-17 puts hundreds of rounds into the air per second. Mathematics is against us. That evening, Baumbach wrote his report. Like all test pilot reports, it was detailed and technical. Performance specifications, handling characteristics, systems evaluation. But Baumbach added a section that would prove prophetic, even though it would be largely ignored by Luftwaffe High Command. The B-17 Flying Fortress represents a fundamentally different approach to bomber design. German bombers prioritize offensive capability. The B-17 prioritizes survival. The 1350 caliber machine guns are not merely defensive weapons. They are an integral part of a system designed to ensure the aircraft completes its mission and returns home. Most significantly, the quality and quantity of defensive armament indicates that America can afford to install this level of weaponry on every bomber. This suggests industrial production capacity far exceeding previous intelligence estimates. If the Americans can field hundreds or thousands of these bombers, each carrying 13 heavy machine guns, our fighter forces will face unsustainable attrition. Recommendation: German fighter tactics must be revised to minimize exposure to B-17 defensive fire. Head-on attacks from above, diving through the formation at maximum speed, offer the best chance of survival. Prolonged engagement with B-17 formations should be avoided. Most critically, German bomber design philosophy must incorporate survivability as a primary requirement, not an afterthought. The report was filed, discussed at a conference, and ultimately dismissed. The assessment was considered overly pessimistic. Yes, the B-17 was a capable bomber, but German fighters were superior. Luftwaffe pilots had the training and skill to overcome American numbers. Quality would triumph over quantity. This was the official position, and any evidence to the contrary was inconvenient. But Baumbach's predictions began coming true almost immediately. By summer of 1943, B-17s appeared over Germany in formations of 200 or more aircraft. Each bomber carried its 1350 calibers. Each formation represented over 2,600 heavy machine guns flying in mutual support, creating what German pilots described as a sky filled with tracers. Luftwaffe fighter losses mounted steadily. The tactics that had worked against British bombers proved suicidal against B-17 formations. Pilots who tried to engage from behind or from the sides flew into concentrated fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. Many never returned. Those who survived reported the same thing. You couldn't fight through that much defensive fire. You could make one pass, perhaps two if you were lucky, and then you had to break off before the accumulated fire found you. By late 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units were suffering 20 to 30% casualties per mission against B-17 formations. These were unsustainable losses. The pilots being shot down were experienced veterans, men who had survived years of combat. They couldn't be easily replaced. New pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs were even more vulnerable, dying on their first or second missions. The mathematics Baumbach had identified in his report were playing out in blood over Germany. The B-17s kept coming, day after day, mission after mission. When one was shot down, 10 more appeared the next day. American production lines were turning out bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. And every bomber carried those 1350 calibers, creating an cumulative defensive capability that overwhelmed German fighter forces through sheer volume of fire. The captured B-17 that Baumbach had flown continued to serve the Luftwaffe throughout the war. Repainted in German markings and designated with the code DL+XC, it toured fighter bases across Germany and occupied Europe. Luftwaffe pilots sat in the cockpit, examined the gun positions, and learned what they were facing. The aircraft became a training aid, helping pilots understand their enemy. But understanding the enemy didn't change the strategic reality. Germany was fighting an industrial war against an opponent with overwhelming production capacity. The B-17, with its 1350 caliber machine guns and robust construction, was evidence of that capacity. Every design decision, every component, every system reflected a nation that could afford to build aircraft this way, that could install this much defensive capability on every single bomber. Werner Baumbach survived the war. He continued test flying at Rechlin, evaluating captured Allied aircraft and new German designs. He flew jets, rockets, everything the increasingly desperate Third Reich could produce. After Germany's surrender, he was interrogated by Allied intelligence officers who found his reports in captured Luftwaffe archives. They asked him about the B-17 evaluation in March of 1943. Had he really concluded, from one test flight, that German fighters faced unsustainable losses? "I concluded that from the defensive armament system," Baumbach explained, 1350 caliber machine guns, interlocking fields of fire, sophisticated gun sights, and the knowledge that America was producing hundreds of these bombers. The mathematics were clear. Our fighters couldn't sustain the casualty rates that engaging these formations would require. Your report recommended tactical changes. Tactics can only do so much. If you must attack a target that can defend itself this effectively, casualties are inevitable. The only solution is to not attack, and that wasn't strategically acceptable. The final numbers told the story Baumbach had predicted. Over 12,700 B-17s were built during the war. At peak production, Boeing and its licensed manufacturers produced over 400 per month. Each bomber carried 1350 caliber machine guns. That represented over 165,000 heavy machine guns installed on B-17s alone, not counting B-24s, B-29s, and other American bombers. For comparison, Germany's entire machine gun production, for all purposes, aircraft, ground vehicles, infantry, totaled approximately 1 million weapons from 1939 to 1945. The Americans put a significant percentage of that total onto one bomber type alone. The B-17 participated in every major bombing campaign in Europe. It destroyed German industrial capacity, oil refineries, transportation networks, and military installations. But perhaps its most significant impact was the one Baumbach identified in his report: attrition. The Luftwaffe bled itself dry, trying to stop B-17 formations, losing experienced pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, not because German pilots lacked courage. They fought with desperate determination until the end. Not because German aircraft were inadequate. Late war fighters like the Focke-Wulf Ta-152 and Messerschmitt Me-262 jet were excellent designs, but because the industrial and mathematical reality Baumbach had identified proved inescapable. America could build more bombers than Germany could shoot down. Each bomber carried enough defensive armament to inflict unacceptable losses on attacking fighters, and the cumulative effect, hundreds of bombers, thousands of machine guns, endless production capacity, overwhelmed Germany's ability to defend itself. The 1350 caliber machine guns that made the B-17 a flying fortress were more than weapons. They were a statement. America fights with resources, with production capacity, with the ability to put overwhelming firepower on every single bomber. And in industrial warfare, that approach proved decisive. There's a broader lesson in this story, beyond military history. Werner Baumbach flew the B-17 in March of 1943 and immediately understood what Germany faced. He wrote an accurate assessment, predicted the outcome, and recommended changes. His reward was to be ignored and to watch his predictions come true over the next 2 years as the Luftwaffe was ground down by exactly the attrition he'd warned about. He wasn't alone. Throughout the German military, competent officers saw the reality and tried to warn their superiors. Albert Speer knew Germany couldn't win a production war. Adolf Galland knew the fighter forces were being bled dry. Field Marshal Erhard Milch New American industrial capacity was overwhelming, but in the Nazi system, being right mattered less than being optimistic. Truth was subordinate to ideology. The P-17 Flying Fortress, with its 1350 caliber machine guns, was physical evidence of a reality that Germany's leadership refused to accept, not because they couldn't understand it. The mathematics were simple, but because accepting it meant admitting the war was unwinnable. And so, the war continued even after the outcome was determined, and men like Baumbach, who understood the truth, were powerless to change it. Today, several B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by museums and preservation organizations. When you see one fly, when you hear the distinctive roar of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, it's worth remembering what these aircraft represented. Not just bombers, but industrial capacity made visible. Not just weapons, but a statement about how America fights wars with resources, production, and overwhelming material superiority. And if you look closely at the turrets, the gun positions, the 13 locations where 50 caliber Browning machine guns once bristled from the airframe, you're seeing the reason German pilots called it a flying fortress, not because it was invincible, plenty were shot down, but because attacking one meant facing firepower that could, and often did, destroy the attacker. Werner Baumbach understood this in March of 1943 after 3 hours flying a captured bomber. The tragedy is that his understanding came too late to change anything, even if his superiors had listened. By then, thousands of B-17s were already in production or planning. The 1350 caliber machine guns were already being manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. The outcome was already determined. All that remained was for the mathematics to play out in the skies over Germany until there was nothing left to defend. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.